Welcome to the podcast today. If you've been following me on Instagram, you've seen that I took a little trip last week. I had to take my son up to Calgary to visit the doctor and decided to do a little family history trip while I was at it. So I'm going to talk about that trip today, show you how I mapped out the locations where my great-great-grandfather lived and great-grandfather, and show you a bit of their story. Okay, so I'm going to tell you the story of my great-great-grandfather, Isaac Sanford Fries. So he was born in New Brunswick. He married someone. They had 3 children. One of their children, she died at 18 days old. They had 2 children. In 1883, Isaac decided to venture out west, see what it was like there. They had a general store in New Brunswick, and he wanted to see what the West was like. Ended up coming to Calgary, Alberta I think he got there in June of 1883. He set up camp there and everything, and I'm going to tell you his story, his family story, and show you some pictures and maps along the way. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so Isaac arrived in Calgary, it was Fort Calgary at the time, in June of 1883. The week after arriving, he traveled to Winnipeg to get supplies while his business partner built like a small wood frame store that was actually on the east side of the Elbow River here in Calgary. So you can see the train tracks here, and it was just north of the railroad tracks is where they had this little tent city of all of the first settlers in Calgary. So they were going to build a little store there. They had it there right in the middle of the village. By December, here's this advertisement. He was now not in business with his partner anymore. It was just himself. He was in business in December of 1883. You can see this little advertisement in the local newspaper. So then it says in January this is from like a little, here, I'll show it. This is like a little, it's not a magazine. Well, I guess it is a magazine about him. Beginnings of Calgary. It's like an Alberta history journal. That's the word, a journal. Okay, so you have a whole journal about him, which gives the history. He wrote letters back to his wife in New Brunswick. And so a lot of the history of the area, his letters helped to explain what was going on. So in January of 1884, the CPR, the railroad, opened its town site west of the Elbow and offered lots for sale. It says 60 persons took part in the draw, but luck was not with Fries as he was number 50. Anyways, he got some lots to then build in what was going to be Calgary. So they had first initially settled east of the Elbow River. Now they were going to settle the actual town of Calgary west of the Elbow River. Okay, so he got 2 spots. He got a lot for their store and then a lot for their house. He actually dragged they took his store from that location on the east of the Elbow River to the lot that he had purchased on Atlantic Avenue. Okay, so here is actually the map that he drew, a map to send to his wife to tell her about the lot that he purchased here for their store and then the lot that he purchased for their house here. And he has the post office right here and then the church. And then he has an X here for actually where the church is going to end up being because they couldn't get this lot. So I think that's pretty cool that he drew this whole map and everything to show his wife. And he wrote this letter in March of 1884, and his wife arrived in Calgary a month later with their 2 children. Now, something that was very sad is on the trip over from New Brunswick, his daughter actually got sick. It's probably influenza. 3 days later, after they arrived in Calgary, she passed away at 4 years old, which was very heartbreaking for Isaac and their family. He was so excited about his family coming to Calgary, and his second daughter had now passed away. And then my great-grandfather was the other son that was there. They did end up adopting a child that had the same name as their first daughter who had passed away, Edith. And so we're not quite sure how that happened, but there was a family that I think couldn't take care of her or whatever, and Isaac and Evelyn Fries, they adopted her. Not sure if it was official or not, but they raised her. So kind of an aside. So they've got this lot in 1884, and then by 1885, you can see this is Atlantic Avenue, now 9th Avenue Southeast in Calgary. And here are a bunch of stores here. You can see his is actually this one here, like 1, 2, 3, and then this fourth one here after that barn. This was on Atlantic Avenue, taken in 1885. So like the following year he had built that store. Here is in November of 1886, there was a large fire in Calgary that burned a lot of the buildings, a lot of the stores. You can see the store right next to him actually burned down, but his stayed standing. But so this is where present day is. This is on my little trip. I was trying to figure out, this image is actually from Google Maps because it turned out to be kind of hard to stop and take pictures of these places driving in downtown Calgary. So here is 9th Avenue Southeast, which was Atlantic Avenue. So all of those stores would have been along this street here. So I'm not exactly sure if this is where their lot was, but this is the lot of where their house would have been if they actually ended up building a house on that lot that he had purchased in 1884. Not sure if they were living here still in 1891, but this is a little park that is right there. That would have been where that house would have been. So this is where it got a little confusing because there are a lot of photos for this family in the Glenbow archives because he's one of like the founding people of Calgary. But this home was supposedly their first home. But that doesn't really make sense to me because like I think their first home they lived in was probably not this extravagantly built. So I'm not totally sure. I don't think this was the house that was built on back on this map where he, put that this is where their house was going to be on Stephen Avenue and I think it's like Drinkwater Street, which is now 2nd Street, I believe. Anyways, so I don't think that was that home. And there was conflicting. One thing said it was on the corner of 3rd Avenue East and 3rd Street, and one said it was on 3rd Avenue East just off Center Street. So I'm not totally sure where it was, but here is a picture of a house that they lived in sometime before 1909. Okay. Here's the house. The trees are a little more grown, and this was supposedly in 1906 is when this picture was taken. So that picture before would have been taken, I don't know, however fast trees grow, like at least a few years before then. So it's quite a large house, and they did often have boarders and lodgers living with them, but that is where their house was. So after that building, that street was all kind of destroyed with the fire and everything. He built a new sandstone building, which is kind of interesting. After that fire, all of the buildings were supposed to be built with sandstone to help prevent fires from destroying buildings, right? So here is, he erected a building in 1887 called the Fries Block at 122 8th Avenue Southeast. This is what it looks like in 1958. He had sold it to someone in 1893, and then this is that street on 8th Avenue. So I'm not sure if it would have been right here. These buildings, like this is from 1903 to 1910. It has those years up there, the Nielsen Block. So maybe it was right next to there. This is like 2 over from here is 116. So maybe this is 118 or 120, and then he would have been 122. Interestingly, his store was destroyed by fire in 1985. The front of the building was sandstone, but the back building and the things that they had added onto the store were all wooden and I guess caught fire and ended up having to get torn down. Now, after he sold it in 1893, he sold his store for $10,000, which is quite a lot of money at that time, right? We think that that was probably when he started planning what to do. In 1898, him and his son Dio, my great grandfather, decided to join the gold rush. So here in 1901, he's on the 1901 census. Dio isn't there, but Isaac is listed there. So I'm not sure if Dio was there the whole time. Maybe he came back. I'm not sure. Or maybe he's somewhere else. But they were in the Klondike in the Yukon for about 6 years. They came back to Calgary in 1904. So then he likely used some of that money that from their sale, the $10,000 of a store, to pay for this excursion. Back at home, so also in the 1901, Isaac is enumerated living in Calgary. Probably his wife just reported him as living there. I'm not really sure. And Dio is actually also listed there too, so I'm not sure if he was there or if he was in the Yukon with his father. But you can see they had quite a few boarders living with them also. So then after he got back in 1904, I'm guessing because he did not build another store, at least from what I read, so it looks like he helped his two sons. So he had one son, Stanley Gordon, that seemed to be really entrepreneurial and started another store. Also is called the Freeze Block, but it says SG Freeze here on this little sign here. So this was his store in 1910. And then his other son, Dio, also built a store a bit south of there. So here's in 1911, they were living on 4th Avenue Southeast, which is this house here. This is the one, if you were watching my Instagram stories today, I was confused because it says their address was 122 4th Avenue, and on Google Maps it says that that's between 2nd and 3rd Street, which in my mind it should be between 1st and 2nd Street. So I'm not totally sure if this is where it would have been. It might have been the block over, but this is where Google Maps says it was. But who knows? It doesn't really matter, but it was somewhere in that neighborhood. So this was their home in 1911 and also in 1916 and in 1921. And then here's that same home in 1966, but it's been since torn down. So Isaac's son Dio, who's my great grandfather, likely used his proceeds from the Klondike goldfields to purchase a store site and lots nearby. So he had a store and then a home next door, or at least close by, it seems like. And this is the empty lot. So my dad actually lived here also. So Dio had a son also named Dio, and then who was my grandpa. And they lived along this street, which was First Street A, southeast. But it's all of these homes have been torn down. So their store would have been there. He purchased 2 lots, and then also his brother Stanley built a grocery warehouse next door also. So this was kind of their stomping grounds, but it's all been torn down and nothing's been built there. So I'm not sure why it was torn down, but that is where Isaac's son Dio lived. In 1925, Isaac's wife Evelyn passed away, and Isaac went to Vancouver to live with his son Stanley, who had moved there and was into real estate, doing quite well. Isaac must not have enjoyed it a ton out there because he ended up coming back to Calgary and lived out his days fishing, hunting, curling, and spending time with his son Dio, grandchildren, and other children. And then Isaac died in 1936 at the age of 88. Well, that's just a quick summary of Isaac and his life in Calgary, but I thought I would show you how I created the maps that I used to plot out where they lived, how I got addresses and all of that. So you can find addresses for where your ancestors lived from, lots of different places, depending on where that was recorded. But some places that I got them from were city directories. That's a great place to get addresses from. There's city directories for lots of different years, almost every year in some cities that they would have those. So if your ancestor lived in a city, they would have their address of their residence and their employment. So if they own their own store, like my great grandpa and great great grandpa did, they would be listed there. So that's why I found some. And then also archives. So I was lucky that there are photos of him and his home, and there was addresses there. Some of them kind of conflicted, and so I'm not totally sure what is correct, but that's a place that you can find addresses. A big one is census records. So you can see that the address was written on some of those census records that I found. And sometimes you'll be able to find addresses there. If your ancestor was a farmer, you might have like, it might be like a plot map, like a township road, a meridian, a section, and all of that, which you will need to access another website to try to figure out where that actually was. What else can you find addresses on? Well, any document. So quite often on like a death record or a birth record, it will list the address or the residence of the deceased or the parents of the child that was born. So you can look on those types of records, even marriage records, any of those records, just pay attention to the addresses, take note of those, and then you can start building a map. Okay, so I'm going to show you how I built a map. So it was a bit of a trial and error because I would like put something down and then I'd find another record that maybe was a little different. And it was quite hard because Calgary downtown pretty much has all been demolished except some of those old buildings, but a lot of them have been torn down. So you can just put in an address here, but if the address doesn't exist, it might take you somewhere weird. So you might just want to figure out where it is just based on what the streets are. So, for instance, he was at 122 4th Avenue. So, when I looked at the Calgary maps, for some reason, between Center Street and Second and First Street is considered like 122. So I put it there. I had originally had it over here between Second and Third Street, but so you can just add a marker and then click where you want it to go. And then you can add information here. You can add the address, or you can see all of these have different labels. So some might put the address, some might put the year, and then that was their house or whatever. And then you can add information here and then hit save. And then you can change the color. You can change the icon. There's lots of fun things that you can do. You can even add a photo to that. So if you wanted to add an old photo, then you can have that there. Then you have all of these items here. And then when you go into Google Maps, that's where I was looking at some of those places. So you go into Google Maps and click on saved here, and then you can add lists here. But if you click on maps, then you can see all of the maps that you have, and then it will have all of those labels there that then you can look at. So now I have all those labels for him. You can see that one that I just added. And then his son, Dio, my great-grandfather actually lived down here. So you can see the lots here. And then I think this was his store, although some say it was right next door to his house. I don't know for sure. Anyways, so you can map those out that way. And then once you're in Google Maps, you're driving around, you can navigate to all of those places. So hopefully that helped you out. I feel like that was kind of a whirlwind of an episode then maybe. When I started mapping out the places, like I've always been curious where he actually lived in Calgary, and our family hadn't ever figured that out or like went and looked at these places. We just knew it was downtown. Once I started mapping it out, like then you start being like, okay, well, when did he live here actually? And maybe that conflicts with what's over here. So then it really helps you to figure out the holes and maybe how you can find more information to figure out where they were in between two things. It was interesting for me to see as I was doing this, just the timeline. So he sold his store in 1893, and then 5 years later, he's going up to the gold rush, probably using some of that funds to make his way up there. So to see that, okay, he wasn't tied down to a store at that time, so that makes sense why he could leave for 6 years to go try to get gold, right? Anyways, so it's been kind of fun to dive deeper into where my great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather lived, what life might have been like for them day to day, where their store was in relation to where their house was, where his children also had stores, where their church was, see how close it is to the Bow River. He loved to fish, so he probably spent a lot of time along the banks of that Bow River right by his house. And it helps me to kind of personify him more, make him feel more real and make that connection more real to him. So, hope you give that a try. Building maps is actually one of my favorite ways to really get to know my ancestors more, really figure out where they lived in relation to other places and other people. So, give it a try if you want more help to be able to really get deep into knowing who your ancestors were, looking at their story more. In my course, Know Your Ancestor, we talk about this a lot. We talk about, finding those pieces of information on records and then mapping them. I do have a tutorial in the course about how to map where your ancestors lived. So, you can go get that. The link will be in the show notes. But thanks for watching today. Thanks for listening, being a part of the podcast. If you are enjoying the podcast, I'd love to hear about it. Share it with your friends, family, on Instagram, whatever. Tag me. All right. Well, thanks for listening today, and we'll see you next time.